preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Y for the first evening of our series, The Politics of Sexuality, Gays, Lesbians, and Society, a series which has been produced cooperatively by the Y's group services and education departments. The impetus for this series came from program staff here at the Y who believe that the issues and concerns of an increasingly visible gay and lesbian community are of interest not only to that community, but to the general public as well. For over 100 years, the 92nd Street Y has served a diverse population of New Yorkers, offering both social service and educational programs, which provide support and services to special population groups, and which also address issues of social, political, and cultural concern to the general public. We are dedicated to this mission and are proud to present this unique series, a series which deals openly with some of the most pressing personal, social, and political concerns facing both the straight and gay segments of our society today. The 4 evenings deal with a broad spectrum of issues. Tonight, we open with a discussion of historical and cross-cultural perspectives on homosexuality. Next Saturday, the question, "Is there a gay sensibility?" will be considered. On November 14th, the focus of the discussion will be on the politics of discrimination and issues such as government and civil rights, privacy and the sodomy statute, housing and job discrimination, tax reform, and funding for AIDS research and treatment, among others. The series concludes on November 21st with a look at the range of Jewish responses to homosexuality, both within and outside of the Jewish and gay communities. The format for tonight is as follows. Professor Esther Newton will deliver her lecture, following which Professor Martin Duberman will present his remarks. Dr. Newton's talk will center around cross-cultural issues. Dr. Duberman will provide a historical context. After their presentations, you will have an opportunity to present your questions, which you can write on the index cards you received upon entering the hall. During the course of the evening, ushers will come down the aisles, collect your cards, and bring them backstage for presentation. It is now a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Martin Bommel Duberman. Tonight, Professor Duberman joins Dr. Newton as a featured speaker, as well as serving as series moderator for the remaining 3 evenings of the series. He will soon be out here on stage to introduce her to you. Martin Bommel Duberman is Distinguished Professor of History at Lehman City University of New York. He previously taught at Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. His play, In White America, ran for a 1.5 years off-Broadway, toured internationally, and was given the Vernon Rice Drama Desk Award. He's also the author of 10 books, including Black Mountain, An Exploration in Community, James Russell Lowell, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, Charles Francis Adams, which was awarded the Bancroft Prize, and most recently, About Time, Exploring the Gay Past. He has just completed a biography of Paul Robeson, which will be published in 1988. Professor Duberman was a founding member of the Gay Academic Union, sat on the originating boards of the National Gay Task Force and the Lambda Legal Defense Fund, and for the past 6 years has been on the board of the New York Civil Liberties Union. It's an honor to welcome him here tonight. Please join me now in welcoming Martin Bommel Duberman. Thank you.
Thank you. Esther and I were conferring backstage, and I have to begin by telling you that we didn't know this until dinner tonight, but both of us went to separate beds in our separate apartments down with Coles as of Wednesday. I'm telling you this because our voices are not what they might ordinarily be, and I hope you'll make allowance for that. When Susan Weisfuss and Laura Kaminsky of the 92nd Street Y staff came to me some 6 months ago with the idea for this series. I was delighted and eager to participate and help them toward planning it, because the event seemed to me on several potential levels to mark a milestone. Excuse me, before we go, I can't see with my glasses on or off given the particular height of this podium. Can we either raise it or? I think so. Yes, good. Okay. The reason I call this series a potential milestone, at least, is that this is the first time that the prestigious Y has lent its platform to openly gay men and lesbian women so that they themselves could describe their own lives in their own way. Previously, mainstream America has been largely content to let everyone but us pronounce on the meaning of our lives, pronouncements which, in their single-minded distortions, have often left us literally speechless when they did not leave us angry. Everyone has been asked to give expert testimony on our lives except us, the actual experts. We therefore welcome this unique mainstream opportunity to speak for ourselves. We welcome, too, the opportunity for affirmation in a time of negation and despair. The terrible scourge of AIDS has wreaked havoc in our community, even as it has simultaneously mobilized and unified us. Most of our energy in recent years has necessarily gone into rituals of grief and into measures of defense, as a largely indifferent straight world has preferred to let us die rather than offer us succor and support. The casualties have been not only in lives, but in confidence. Friends are gone, and so is a certain esprit. With what energy does remain, we look toward a redefinition of who we are, have been, and want to be. We are in the introspective mood that always follows upon loss. We are here tonight and in this series generally to share something of our introspection, to share insights and information about our lives, past and present, which we do not feel is often conveyed by the mainstream media. We are not here to polemicize, exhort, harangue, or even persuade. We assume, and I think correctly, though the lights are so high that I can't see anybody out there, I don't know whether there are 5 people or 500, but nonetheless, we assume, I think correctly, that those of you who have decided to attend this series have done so out of genuine concern for a better understanding of who gay people are, and with an already respectful appreciation for the value of our lives. In that spirit, we welcome you, and we thank you for being here with us. I myself, as Laura Kaminsky has already said, will tonight survey the history of gay and lesbian people for you, and Professor Esther Newton will tell you something about same gender, love and lust in non-industrial, non-Western cultures. Following our 2 speeches, we will take questions from the floor. Professor Newton will speak first. She is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the State University of New York at Purchase, and her book, Mother Camp: Female Impersonators in America, is widely considered to be one of the first classics in the burgeoning field of gay studies. Currently, she is at work on a history of Cherry Grove, the watering resort on Fire Island, which for 60 years has been all at once a refuge and a crucible for gay culture. Please help me welcome Professor Newton.
This is the water. Okay. It is very hard to see. There. Maybe you could put them up a little bit more. There, right, that's better. Anthropologists, with a few lonely exceptions, contributed very little to our understanding of sexuality before the 1970s. Because sexuality is a taboo topic in our own culture, fieldworkers didn't ask other cultures about sex either, or if they did, they didn't write up what they saw and heard. Most of what was done in earlier years was marred by an all-male perspective, as male anthropologists conferred with male members of other cultures. Moral judgments and evasiveness like marital relations are unhappy, or happy, doesn't make any difference, or people indulge in sexual license were the rule. Although in general we, anthropologists, were supposed to interact with the so-called natives, and actually social intercourse is the only way to learn another way of life, sexual contact was a no-no. We knew only by the rare confession or by professional gossip that it happens, regardless. Certainly people didn't write about it. No, as hard as anthropologists have tried, in politics or religion, say, to see past our own cultural noses, when looking down there, we have shown the same ignorance and done the same name-calling as most other Westerners. We too are members of a society tied up in knots over everyone's sex life, in which many people would literally rather let others die, they assume it will be others, than have certain sex words appear in public. Even the great chronicler of the Trobriand Islanders, Malinowski, one of the few who took sex seriously enough before the 1970s to publish a scholarly book about it, and incidentally, he recorded his sexual contact with the Trobriand women, who he referred to as niggers, in a secret diary. He was accused by the French feminist scholar Briffaut of being what Briffaut called an Adam and Eve anthropologist, for saying that, quote, marriage is regarded in all human societies as a sacred transaction establishing a relationship of the highest value to men and women. Marriage, as we idealize it, is no more universal than is man-on-top heterosexual intercourse. To describe the shapes that marriage or desire takes in other traditions, we have to take off our Judeo-Christian glasses. When missionaries decreed that masturbation, for instance, was immoral, they drove it underground but did nothing to understand other people's morality. Unfortunately, neither missionaries nor anthropologists see with the naked eye, but always through the lens of culture. The best that we can do, and probably the best we'll ever be able to do, is a kind of correction, which means that Western words and concepts have to be extracted from their connotations before they can be packed in the anthropologist's intellectual luggage. Development of a metacultural language, one that transcends our own time and place, is what the anthropological enterprise is all about. The early anthropologists found some other peoples reckoning their close kin, for instance, only through women. Very quickly, the idea of kinship had to be stripped of the assumption that English kinship names are simply biology writ large. An aunt can be our mother's sister, but she can also be our father's brother's wife. Other peoples don't have aunts, not even by another name, because aunt is an idea. It's not a biological reality. As the French anthropologist Lévi-Strauss concluded, kinship does not consist in the objective ties of descent or consanguinity, meaning genetic links, between individuals. It exists only in human consciousness. It is an arbitrary system of representations. Because anthropologists already accepted the necessity of suspending Western assumptions to look at the okay or respectable areas of culture, when the energy of feminism and gay liberation propelled some of us, mainly feminists, lesbians, and gay men, toward previously submerged questions about sex and gender, we were a jump ahead. Desire, we began to think, is less like a heart, throbbing the same everywhere, and more like music, and every culture has its own, not only songs, but tonality, instruments, and occasions. To borrow a good metaphor from anthropologist Carol Vance, it is not our ears which compose symphonies, nor is it our genitals or our hormones which determine the erotic. Genitals, like ears, are just receptors. It is the brain which activates, or does not activate, hormones which produce sexual excitement. This is not to say that sexual excitement can be created or destroyed on conscious command, far from it. But desire, like music, is inscribed in a particular tradition, the medium from which our eroticism takes shape. In Sex and Temperament, Margaret Mead showed that what is considered manly or womanly depends on which society is doing the considering. In The Traffic in Women, an influential 1975 essay, Gayle Rubin proposed the idea of what she called the sex-gender system, a set of arrangements by which a society transforms biological sexuality into products of human activity, and in which these transformed needs are satisfied. By gender, anthropologists mean cultural categories to which infants are assigned when adults first inspect the child's genitals. In our hospitals, when the genitals are ambiguously sexed, and incidentally that happens fairly frequently, the baby is called a girl or a boy anyway, and nature is surgically altered to fit. Biology is even less the determinant of human sexual response. It is not flesh in itself that makes people hot, as we say, but flesh infused with beliefs and ideas. In the domain of the erotic, actions, fantasies, pictures, games, rituals, or simply words lead, or are supposed to lead, to genital arousal. Anthropologists and historians who share this approach call ourselves social constructionists. When we try to find out what other people's sexual beliefs and actions really are, as opposed to supposing they are like, or at least a reflection, either primitive or liberated, of ours, the results are unsettling. Let me give you an example from the Mehinaku people, who are Amazonian Indians. Need a little water before this one. You'll need water too. Okay, Mehinaku men told the anthropologist, in this case, the following story. And he called the story, or they call the story, the wandering vagina. In ancient times, all the women's vaginas used to wander about. Today, women's vaginas stay in one place. One woman of ancient times, Tukwi, had a vagina that was especially foolish. While Tukwi slept, her vagina would crawl about the floor of the house, thirsty and hungry, looking for manioc porridge and fish stew. Creeping about, snail-like on the ground, it found the porridge pot and slit the top off. One of the men awoke and listened. "Ah, nothing but a mouse," he said, and he went back to sleep. But as the vagina slurped up the porridge, another man awoke and took a brand from the fire to see what was happening. "What is this?" he said. To him, it looked like a great frog with a nose and immense mouth. Moving closer, he scorched the vagina with his torch. Oh, it scurried back to its owner, slipping right inside her. She cried and cried, for she had been burned. Then Tukwi called all the women and lectured them. "All you women, don't let your genitals wander about. If they do, they may get burned as mine were." And so, today, women's genitals no longer go wandering about. Incidentally, they believe that men's genitals also can move and do things that we don't think of them as doing. Recorded by anthropologist Thomas Gregor in Anxious Pleasures, an extraordinary book about the sexual life of the Mehinaku, this story exemplifies the thick descriptions we need most. not simply international Kinsey reports, X% of Mehanaku have masturbated by age 10, but acts embedded in their significance. In medieval Europe, heterosexual intercourse was seen as agricultural. The male peasant plowing a female field and sowing seeds to harvest crop children. And so pervasive is this metaphor, not pervasive, but so has such a staying power, that when I say this to students today, they understand perfectly. They all know what the different elements of the metaphor are supposed to mean. Such metaphors both reflect and guide action. In this case, the correct position for intercourse, its legitimate purpose, and the right relation of the genders. The Mehanaku see intercourse as being like food preparation and eating. Intercourse is said to resemble the process by which women prepare the manioc root for cooking. Both sex and scraping are done in a squat. Male and female genitals are also likened to mouths, and at orgasm, a man is said to vomit semen. It is hungry genitals that seek intercourse. Babies are made from semen, and a vagina has to eat a lot of it. How do women and men experience desire when the penis is a mouth or an edible rather than a tool or a gun? When vaginas go adventuring at night, even if they are punished for it, what notion of women's sexual initiative is supposed? If heterosexuality means genital contact between biological males and females, this is an example, but not as we know it. There are too few studies like Gregor's, and if the evidence on sexuality in general is scanty and distorted by moral judgments, that on homosexuality is much worse. To give you some idea, Edgar Gregerson's 1982 update on Ford and Beach's pioneering cross-cultural work, Patterns of Sexual Behavior. This was done in 1951, and it was inspired by Kinsey's work in our own society. Anyhow, when Gregerson went back to update that material, he found sexual data on 294 societies. When you consider there are probably about 3,000 distinct human societies, that's only 10% that there's any data at all. Of these, about half mention male homosexuality and 1/3 female homosexuality, though in most cases, there was no information by the anthropologist on the culture's attitude toward it, whether it was approved, disapproved, much less anything richer than that. The usual combination of taboo, male anthropologist, and male informant has left lesbian behavior so unexplored that all generalizations are provisional only. But having said all that, what do we know? Homosexual relations take a profusion of shapes which fall into four main types, and this was first suggested, as far as I know, by Gregerson, who was an anthropologist at Queen's, and elaborated on by Barry Adam. And these types may or may not eventually fit lesbian behavior. And I also want to point out that the fact that no such preliminary classification has been done on heterosexual behavior worldwide shows just how taken for granted and hence completely unknown heterosexuality is. We actually know more about homosexuality worldwide in a way than we do about heterosexuality. First of all, back to homosexuality. Many groups practice juvenile homosexuality, that is, sex play among children and youth. It tends to be premarital, casual, and generally causes no great social consternation. Even our homophobic, sexually anxious culture has the circle jerk, the schoolgirl crush, and playing house or doctor. Secondly, there is age-structured or intragender homosexuality. A younger partner, usually a pre-adolescent or adolescent, has sexual relations with an older partner or partners of the same gender. Many or all members of a society may be involved, but generally at a defined stage of life. Age-structured homosexuality was legitimate for men and probably for women in classical Greece, as Marty will explain in more detail next. These were essentially student-teacher bonds, as celebrated in Plato's Symposium and in Sappho's poetry. It is also common, this age-structured homosexuality, common among Australian Aborigines and very widespread in New Guinea for men, and again, maybe for women. There are some clues, but that's about all we know. Boys are initiated into manhood over a period of years by elaborate rituals. Among them, eating, this is their concept, eating the semen of older males. In some society by fellatio, in others by anal intercourse, in other types by absorbing sperm through cuts in the skin. Like the Mehanaku, the Amazonian Indians, whose passion is male-male wrestling, but who shun homosexual relations, the New Guineans equate semen and saliva. They also equate it with breast milk. Yams are smeared with saliva to make them grow big, just as boys are fed semen, and in some of these cultures the yams are smeared with saliva and the boys are smeared with semen. It's totally parallel. The sexuality is a ritual vehicle. This work done on Melanesia, on New Guinea, by Kenneth Reed, Gil Hurt, and a number of others, by the way, is wonderfully rich and sophisticated and calls every preconceived notion that we Westerners have about sexual orientation into question. Boys spend years fellating their elders, further years being fellated by juniors, and still wind up, as expected, married fathers. In Greece, Melanesia, and Japan, male homosexuality was associated with masculinity, in varying degrees with masculine beauty, with masculine core identity, or with martial valor. There are two well-documented instances of age-structured homosexuality among women, and in both cases, women are relatively powerful and autonomous. In southern Africa, women from the Basotho tribe form what are called mummy-baby relationships, sexual, sensual, and supportive, with adolescent girls. The older partner is generally married, but husbands work as migrant laborers and are away for long periods of time. There are also socially accepted lesbian couples and groups among Muslim Africans in Mombasa, even though all girls must marry young, writes their ethnographer, the anthropologist who studied them, Gil Shepard. The word in Swahili glossed as lesbian, in other words, the word that we translate into English as lesbian, is msagaji, a grinder. The verb kusaga, to grind, is commonly used for the grinding of grain between millstones, but the close interplay between the two usages is illustrated, perhaps, by the fact that the upper and lower millstones are known as mwana and mama, respectively, child and mother, strictly speaking, or simply young woman and older woman. Of course, all these relationships obey a culture-specific logic. While in New Guinea, male-male sexual relations are an aspect of interaction between kinship groups, and so are forbidden between certain types of kin and expected between others, in Lesotho, a mummy may have several babies, but a baby only one mummy. Makes perfect sense. In age-structured relations, it is usual for the former baby student initiate to become the mummy teacher initiator as an adult, in addition to marrying. A third homosexual context is transgender or gender bending, in which ordinary men or women can appropriately have sex only with special people belonging to variant genders, and these genders often have a supernatural dimension. We know of instances in Africa, Siberia, Polynesia, Indonesia, and Brazil. Especially well documented are gender benders among North American Indians and an East Indian caste, the Hijras. In Hindu tradition, the Hijras are males, excuse me, or in rare cases, hermaphrodites, who live in urban communes under a guru and devote themselves to the worship of Bahuchara Mata, a mother goddess. The Hijras tell this story about their origins. In the time of the Ramayana, which is the Hindu epic, foundation epic, Ram had to leave Ayodhya, his native city, and go into the forest for 14 years. As he was going, the whole city followed him because they loved him so. As Ram came to the edge of the forest, he turned to the people and said, Gods don't address people in the same language, apparently, in India that they do here. He said to the assembled people, "Ladies and gents, please wipe your tears and go away." But these people who were not men and not women did not know what to do. So they stayed there. They stayed there because Ram did not ask them to go. They remained there 14 years, and snake hills grew around them. When Ram returned, he found many snake hills. Not knowing why they were there, he removed them and found so many people with long beards and nails, all meditating. And so they were blessed by Ram, and that is why we Hijras are so respected in Ayodhya. The dharma, or caste obligation, too hot, of the Hijras is to castrate themselves, literally, and live an ascetic, asexual life devoted to the goddess Bahuchara. However, alongside their ritual duties and religious discipline, they sometimes prostitute themselves to or marry men. Not surprisingly, just like our own culture, different people put forward different explanations for this apparent contradiction. Some Hijras told the anthropologist they are driven to prostitution only by desperate poverty. Others insist that boys become Hijras just to have sex with men. The older Hijras bitch that the conduct of some young chelas or disciples brings a bad name on the caste. Their ethnographer, Serena Nanda, adds that Hindu culture is more flexible than ours. Asceticism and sexuality are not necessarily opposites to the Hindu way of thinking. Although once again information on women is much scantier, we do know of female gender benders among North American Indians, Brazilian cult worshippers, and of so-called female husbands in certain African tribes. The fourth and most familiar type of homosexual relation, homophilia, is distinguished from the others by involving adults of approximately the same age and social status. Homophilia is primarily modern and Western, although we do know of a few similar instances, such as lesbian marriage resistors who worked in the silk factories in southern China. Lesbianism in the West sometimes has a gender-bending aspects, what we call roles, and male homosexuality has both gender-bending drag aspects and age-graded elements. There are lots of older, younger couples. But the ritual and spiritual dimensions found in so many other cultures are lacking here. On the other hand, only in the West has a large articulate community developed around a supposed exclusive homosexual orientation. Which of the non-Western traditional contexts will merge with the Western-oriented gay subculture remains to be seen. We know that some of the gender benders, such as the American Indian Berdache, are beginning to think of themselves as gay. Both Berdache and gays have special life-shaping identities that set us apart from other people. Without this reality, gay identity and community, we wouldn't be here tonight. So what can anthropology tell us about homosexuality? Well, clearly homoeroticism is not just a product, whether you think it's decadent or liberating, of Western culture, but occurs among many peoples with an infinite range of meaning. On the other hand, anthropological evidence contradicts the notion that hetero and homosexual, concepts which were only invented in 1869, are actors everywhere on the world stage. Anthropologists have not run around the world looking for other lesbians and gay men, and if they had, they would have been very disappointed. What has happened instead is that Western lesbians and gay men have taken the lead in comparative studies of gender and sexuality. Among us, there really is no essentialist position, such as Marty will be discussing, on sexuality, no notion that people are born with a particular sexual orientation. The evidence, as fragmentary as it is, all points the other way. There is an anthropological axiom that goes, if people believe a thing to be real, that belief has real consequences. Our society is so certain that heterosexual orientation is human nature. For contradicting or flouting that law, gays are hated. Our defense against being called unnatural is to make our own appeal to nature. Either we were born gay, so gays must be born everywhere, or homosexuality is a universal form of desire which other people have repressed. To my mind, neither one of these arguments is necessary to justify a profound identification with gayness and the gay community. No American group has members in all other societies, and none, with the exception of Jews, existed 2,000 years ago. Even Jews, with one of the most seductive claims to exist in nature, and not just nurture, and a glorious and durable history, also anxiously scan the mirror of the past when it gives back no likeness. A recent New York Times article quoted the intense interest felt by Midwestern Jews in Ezekiel Solomon, the first Jewish man to settle Michigan and the Northwest Territories. "It's amazing just to imagine his being here," said a Jewish lawyer, who spent last July at the site of Solomon's 18th century house, bringing some small touch of Yiddishkeit to what must have been such a strange world. That's how comfortable Jews feel in the Midwest. Like gays who expect to find gay liberationists in the past, or must know for sure if two famous women friends actually had sex, the contemporary Jews were disappointed because, quote, not a single artifact reflecting Mr. Solomon's religious faith has yet been found. Even Jewish identity is a complex mosaic, fragile, contested, changing, and fuzzy around the edges. Only Eastern European Jews among the world's Jews would be looking for Yiddishkeit, and Ezekiel Solomon married a Catholic girl. They had 5 children, who, in the absence of a larger Jewish community, most probably ceased to be Jews. The truth is, all identities have to be created and recreated by us, the living. I am writing a history of the gay community of Cherry Grove on Fire Island. The Grove, a small but notorious and wonderful colony of summer houses, has had gay settlers since the mid-1930s and has been almost exclusively gay since the late 1940s. One of my most useful models has been anthropologist Barbara Meyerhoff's Number Our Days, a fascinating study of a Southern California Jewish senior citizen center, which, like Cherry Grove, draws adults from a larger world of members. Like me, Meyerhoff was both a member of and an outsider to the community. At the heart of her work is the question of identity. What is Yiddishkeit? What does it mean to be a Jew in America? The lives of center-old people, like those of gays, have not turned out as expected. Their children are Americanized, apolitical, and mostly absent. If anything, in Cherry Grove, which represents a kind of traditional orthodoxy in the spectrum of modern gay life, identity issues are more taken for granted and less up for grabs. Humans are social animals. From inside our darkest closets to the most routine chores of daily living, we exist and can exist only in the dense web of connectedness. Who shares our web determines what values we hold sacred, which in turn reshapes our web. The process is the same, whether we be Jewish, Mehanaku, or gay. My students often say that labels are limiting. Using the very word labels shows that they feel these identities, gay, Jewish, whatever, as external to themselves, papered on. This is partly an American illusion they share with their elders, that freedom means no limits, no definitions. But it also signals their powerlessness as young people. Identities are limiting if you play no active role in relation to them, if they are simply received. I suppose legs are limiting if you can't walk on them and simply drag them around in a wheelchair or on crutches. But if you can walk, what sense does it make to say legs restrict us? We will never grow wings, so we must use what makes us human. Our identities are more than metaphorical legs. They are our psychic and moral bodies, which explains why people are willing to give birth and to kill in order to preserve them. This aspect of our human nature has its dangers in our interdependent world. As an antidote to all excessive nationalisms, we must recognize that no identity is a given by God or nature, while defending our right to be who we are here and now and to organize for communal survival. The gay community is a proud creation, worth running great risks, even dying for. 500,000 people, including some who are gravely sick, traveled to Washington last weekend and stood for hours in the cold to affiliate with and show their allegiance to the gay community. 800 people defied arrest to protest the homophobic actions of the Supreme Court. That's a lot of folks. As a people, we gays have special gifts of resilience, of humor, of sexual expression, of sensibility. The causes we embody, the right to be different without being persecuted, the right to a greater measure of sexual freedom and choice, and the challenge we pose to rigid gender systems have meaning beyond today's circumstances. Recently, Toni Morrison was asked if she saw herself simply as a writer or as a black woman writer. Did she resent those labels? She replied to the effect that what others called limitations, African or Southern roots, a history of slavery, a female perspective, were the very elements of her creative vision. Far from seeking to escape them or explain them away, she wanted to explore and shape their meaning. So too for me as a gay woman anthropologist. History has placed gay people here. From here, we are making history. Thank you.
Thanks, Esther. I think a lot of what Esther has said you'll find echoed in what I have to say. Apparently the anthropologists and the historians, though both are dealing with fragmentary evidence at this point, are coming up with roughly comparable conclusions. I do want to say at the top that all generalizations about sexual behavior in the past, from a historical perspective, need to be tentative simply because the data at present is limited. Even such data as we have is to some extent contested among the few practitioners who are attempting to interpret it. Until just 10 or 15 years ago, which as scholars measure time is really no time at all, there was no such thing as the formal study of sexual behavior from a historical perspective, and it was not considered a proper subject for professional historians. Let me tell you one personal anecdote which I think illustrates that point. In 1972, when I was appointed to a professorship at City University, I was asked if I would teach at the Graduate Center at 42nd Street as well as at one of the colleges. In my case, it's Lehman College. I said no because, as I explained, I was tired of teaching graduate students at that point. I found them much too dutiful. They tend to write everything down and consider it truth instead of contesting the so-called truth with you. And I said for a while I would simply like to confine my teaching to the undergraduate level. What happened about 5 years after that was that I began to research this new field of sexual history, and particularly the history of gay and lesbian people. And so I went back to the Graduate Center and said now I was prepared to offer a course on the graduate level in sexual history. The response was undiluted horror. I was told that sexual history, which they could barely bear to utter, was not history at all, the subject matter not worthy of formal academic study. And so I told them that, well, first of all, the whole issue became so personally abusive that I withdrew the proposed course, and I told them at the same time that I would no longer sit on their doctoral exam boards and read their doctoral theses, which I had been, even though I was not formally teaching at the Graduate Center. I said clearly, if what I was currently up to in my research was not considered a proper academic discipline, then therefore clearly I was not someone who was qualified to advise and examine PhD candidates. I want to say that can we get the lights down a little at this point? I don't know. Esther and I have different needs, as we discovered long ago. Okay, now I can read again. I do want to add, in regard to that personal anecdote, that the climate has changed considerably at the Graduate Center at CUNY. Esther and I, in fact, have been part of a group of 20 scholars, gay and lesbian, who have been meeting for about a year and a half to put together to try to put together what is this country's first formal academic institute for the study of gay and lesbian people and issues. For a while, we were negotiating with Yale for that institute, but you all know what has happened at Yale. Now we are going to be housed at the Graduate Center at CUNY. As of last May, President Prashansky of the Graduate Center gave the Institute his blessing, and we'll be holding the inaugural event for that institute on November 17th of this year. So as you see, the times, they are a-changing, and at least in this case, changing for the better. To date, in any case, the formal study of the history of gay and lesbian people is barely begun. Informations at this point regarding whole centuries and entire national histories are virtually non-existent. We do have some preliminary findings, and that could not have been said as recently as 1975, and these do allow for some preliminary speculation. Before offering you some of these speculations, let me say at the top that the speculations relate almost entirely to male-male behavior. The study of women in this field, as in all other fields, was not until recently significant. Women were not considered, or the records of their activities were not considered worth preserving, let alone worth studying. We do, for men, have limited evidence which at least suggests three near generalizations. I say near because I don't want to over-dignify our certainty on the matter. First, that sex between men historically usually meant anal intercourse rather than oral contact. Secondly, it usually involved considerable differences in age and social class between the partners. And third, it was part of a bisexual behavioral pattern rather than the pattern of exclusive homosexuality familiar to us today. In other words, where same-gender sex is found historically, so too, usually, side by side, is opposite-gender sex. Until roughly the middle of the 19th century, and the date is disputed, which I'll get to in a minute, a given individual engaging in homosexual behavior seems rarely to have been doing so on an exclusive basis in opposition to heterosexuality. To give you a concrete example of this last point on bisexuality, and at the risk, I'm afraid, of trying to cover a century in a sentence, or per sentence, let me briefly have a look at the classical Greek world. We do have to date possibly more data from the fledgling discipline of gay history on Periclean Athens, say, than we do for almost any other period of human history. In the societies of the ancient world, bisexuality was pervasive. Even before the Greeks, many peoples from the Eastern Mediterranean to Sumeria worshipped a goddess whose rights included both heterosexual and homosexual intercourse. For example, Artemis in Ephesus, Astarte in Phoenicia, Ishtar in Babylon, Anytus in Persia, and Bendis in Thrace. In the Greek world, the poems of Sappho were widely celebrated. Coins were minted in her honor. Coins that bore her image were scattered throughout the Mediterranean world, and statues were erected in her honor. In other words, no stigma was attached to Sappho's lesbianism or perhaps her bisexuality. The existence of a husband and, what is more probable, a daughter continues to be disputed. I don't want here to enter unduly into the theoretical debate about whether bisexuality is, as Freud believed, intrinsic to human nature, that is, biologically grounded. Yet inevitably the question does come up when looking at the ancient world. In Periclean Athens, bisexual behavior among men, once again the data for women is so scanty as not to bear generalization, bisexual behavior about men was so commonplace as to appear utterly normal and natural to contemporaries. Obviously, it's possible for a behavior to be commonplace and yet not biological in origin. Driving a car would be one such example. This is common in our culture, but it is clearly not biological in origin. That behavior, we say, is learned. Fine. But why males in Periclean Athens were so prone to learn bisexual behavior is one of the many conundrums of this new history. In explaining it, some historians adopt a neo-biological position. They argue, or they emphasize, that if biological urges are not themselves the cause, let me backtrack for just a minute. In arguing, first of all, a neo-biological position, I think what some of these historians are saying is that remove the taboos in any given society and you would always have endemic bisexuality. This I call neo-biologic because it is related to Freud's notion that prior to our entry into civilization and its discontents, we all do have a bisexual capacity, one soon lost. Even those historians who do not share this neo-biological point of view do emphasize that if biological urges are not the causes of the widespread bisexuality in the ancient world, obviously no biological imperatives militated against bisexuality either. In other words, there is no evidence, contrary to the Jerry Falwells of the world, that any biological mechanism exists which inhibits human beings from taking physical pleasure and emotional comfort from people of either gender. Respecting sexual preference, nature, or biology would seem to be neutral. We are or are not bisexual depending on whether our society does or does not encourage the activity. The bisexual ambience of the ancient world was ultimately superseded by the homophobia of the Christian centuries that followed. By the time of Theodosius the Great and the Council of Constantinople, meaning 390 AD, edicts were issued declaring homosexuality a capital crime. And in the wake of those edicts, Sappho's poems were consigned to the flames, all but a few fragments lost forever to the world. This is not to say that the Christianized West came merely to exemplify sexual repression. The bawdiness of Chaucer's poetry is alone enough to remind us that stereotyped and static generalizations absurdly compress the actual diversity of 1,000 years of Christian history. Yet it would be just as absurd to ignore the fact that after the triumph of Christianity, disapproval of the pleasures of the sensual life, heterosexual as well as homosexual, was often fierce, even obsessional, as exemplified best perhaps in the penitential books and in the ferocious punishments ordained by the Inquisition. Its handbook, the Malleus Maleficarum, explicitly stated, quote, that all witchcraft comes from carnal lust. Yet in a remarkable 1980 book entitled Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality, the Yale historian John Boswell has argued that until roughly the middle of the 12th century, homosexuality was no more prescribed or circumscribed than was heterosexuality. According to Boswell, until roughly 1150 AD, Catholic Europe regarded same-gender love and lust with astonishing equanimity. Astonishing, of course, from our perspective. Moreover, contrary to the received scholarly wisdom to date that exclusive homosexuality is a recent phenomenon, Boswell has documented the existence of at least some same-gender male couples of the same age who remain together throughout their lifetimes. How many such couples as to warrant the designation a trend remains very much in dispute. Boswell, throughout his discussion, employs modern concepts and terminology, which I, for one, find highly suspect. For example, he argues that there were, quote, gay marriages, gay saints, that several and he uses the word gay, and that several openly gay men were consecrated as bishops. Much of the popular literature of the day, according to him, was often written by, quote, highly regarded clerics and dealt positively with gay love. A thriving gay subculture purportedly reached its apogee between the years 1050 and 1150. It had a rich body of literature, its own argot and conventions, its demi-monde of street prostitutes and brothels, catering to a large clientele from all classes and of varied tastes. According to Boswell, after the mid-12th century, attitudes toward homosexuality underwent a sea change, from being the personal preference, to quote him, of a prosperous minority, satirized and celebrated in popular verse, to a dangerous, antisocial, and severely sinful aberration. In other words, what had been morally and legally acceptable in 1100, by 1300, was regarded as an activity punishable by a death sentence, and often for a single proven act. Why this dramatic transformation? Boswell himself offers two explanations. Their explanations are rather standard, hoary vintage, I fear, but I will pass them on to you for what they're worth. He cites the rise of corporate states with the power and will to regulate the personal aspects of human life, and secondly, the xenophobia and pressure to conform that followed on the Crusades. I don't find such vague causes or efforts at causal explanation particularly persuasive. These are standbys among historians. The rise of the corporate state has been invoked for so long, in tandem, of course, with the rise of the middle class, to explain so many disparate human transformations that it has long ceased, in my view, to have any persuasive explanatory power at all. I think that all we can conscientiously do for now is point to this substantial shift in opinion between 1100 and 1300 without pretending, for the moment, closely to understand its causes. I should add that I'm not the only one who does not accept all of John Boswell's findings. I know that I accept more of them than do most historians in gay and lesbian history. The religious right wing, predictably, has simply ignored Boswell's book. The anti-religious left wing has tended to denounce it as a sophisticated attempt to hold gay Christians to their religious allegiance by exaggerating the church's historical tolerance. These left-wing historians point up what to them is a significant fact, that Boswell himself is a devout and practicing Christian. The debate over Boswell's book and the specifics of his findings will long continue, and I can't really profitably linger over them much longer here. But I do want to say, since I'm more on Boswell's side, or more impressed by some of his findings than many gay historians, the fact that his findings provide balm for gay Christians does not prove that the findings are wrong. There is much in my reading of his book to suggest that at the least, we can now say that the history of Christianity is not one of monolithic opposition to homosexuality. This does not mean, of course, that today's clerical leaders will welcome and embrace that news, Nor does it mean, of course, that they will instantly cease their punitive campaigns against gay people. Christian polemicists have, even before this, shown remarkable lack of embarrassment in ignoring all previous findings of biblical scholarship. For example, the well-known argument from biblical scholars that the sin of Sodom, so-called, originally connoted inhospitality, and that its recent equation with homosexuality is in fact the accumulated result of centuries of garbled translations and corrupted texts. No, biblical exegesis is not the strong point of evangelical Christianity, nor are scholarly findings among their sources of inspiration. And for very obvious reasons. To acknowledge recent scholarship on the Bible or on the history of Christianity would be tantamount to subverting the fundamentalist understanding of how the universe works. Galileo, it will be remembered, was not hailed as a liberator. But now, thanks to this new scholarship, right-wing religious leaders who speak their homophobic words in the confidence that such doctrines can be traced back in an unbroken line to the patristic fathers and Jesus and the apostles can do so only at the expense of a fundamental misreading of historical facts. Let me turn now to a few general remarks about the new scholarship on gay history. Since its beginnings a little more than a decade ago, efforts to reclaim the gay past have focused on two areas of research primarily. First, biography, and secondly, the history of repression. Since almost all the researchers into gay history were and continue to be themselves gay, it is understandable that in the beginning the urge to rediscover gay heroes and heroines proved irresistible. Having grown up with few role models, it was with relief and with pardonable pride that gay scholars were able to add to the roster of predecessors such respected figures as Walt Whitman, Virginia Woolf, Willa Cather, and E.M. Forster. Besides biography, a second major product of gay history has been documenting the history of repression. Here, some of the most telling work has been on Nazi Germany. The long-standing view, one alas which I think still predominates, thanks largely to the meretricious movies of Visconti, was that the Nazi hierarchy was itself dominated by gay men, and indeed that homosexuality and the sort of moral degeneracy associated with the Nazis are common historical companions. Now, thanks to the recent research done by such scholars as Edwin Haberle and Richard Plant, we know how different the true picture is. Tens of thousands of gay people were put to death in Hitler's concentration camps, and Heinrich Himmler himself spearheaded a furious onslaught against gay people as moral degenerates who threatened the purity of the Aryan race. The new scholarship has also focused on the history of the United States. The pioneering researches here of Jonathan Katz has revealed that as early as 1624, the colony of Virginia executed a ship's master for homosexuality, and the New Haven colony served up a notable first in world history when it prescribed the death penalty for lesbianism in 1656. For many decades, the New England clergy debated, quote, unnatural filthiness, John Cotton's words. And they did so with the nuanced logic that had done so much to establish New England's theological preeminence. In 1642, Governor William Bradford reports in the History of Plymouth Plantation, 3 of the colony's most eminent divines gathered to consider the question, quote, what sodomitical acts are to be punished with death? All 3 divines agreed that the Bible ordained the death penalty for, quote, carnal knowledge between 2 men, but they were less confident about certain fine points of doctrine, whether actual penetration needed to be established or whether any, quote, voluntary effusion of seed caused by bodily contact, even without penetration, was itself sufficient ground for execution. The opinion of the three divines clustered toward the latter view, and New England proceeded to a series of executions, which were all the more admired for the conscientious theological exegesis which had preceded. During this same period, it should be noted, two heterosexual child rapists got off with a fine and a whipping. Their offense was not considered to be a capital one. By the time of the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson and a group of liberal reformers had suggested a revision in at least Virginia's law. That revision, not passed, would have eliminated the death penalty for sodomy and substituted instead castration. This, as the world measures such matters, apparently was regarded as progress. Within the last few years, scholars of the gay past have begun to move the focus away from biography and the history of repression and toward a study of how gay people have viewed themselves through time. Here, a sharp divergence of opinion has opened up among scholars. Esther Newton has already alluded to it. The central debate has come to be labeled essentialism versus social constructionism. The debate is largely a recapitulation of a debate familiar to us all, namely the nature-nurture controversy over the relative influence in an individual's life of heredity and environment. The essentialists, of whom John Boswell is one, believe that a consistent and self-identified homosexual personality and presence can be perceived through time and across cultures. The categories homosexual and heterosexual, the essentialists argue, are real and persistent aspects of the human psyche which can be identified historically. The social constructionists, to the contrary, argue that such categories are not unchanging atomic constituents of human erotic desire, not some sort of universal sexual grammar, but rather are the inventions of particular societies and cultures. Homosexual behavior, the constructionists argue, has been organized in many different ways through time, sometimes shaping itself around substantial age and class differences between the partners, sometimes creating third gender categories, sometimes insisting that homosexual behavior conform to traditional gender roles. According to the social constructionists, and I do count myself among their number, our sexual behavior, even our sexual identity, is, like everything else about our humanness, a product of the particular society in which we live, a reflection of its time-specific norms and values. Another central problem in defining this whole new field of gay history has been understanding the history of friendship. Historians of the lesbian past, such as Carol Smith Rosenberg, have been grappling for some time now with the problem of how to characterize the intense friendships between middle-class European and American women during the 18th and 19th centuries. One historian, Blanche Wiesen Cook, argues for a broad definition. According to Cook, quote, "Women who love women, who choose women to nurture and support, and to create a living environment in which to work creatively and independently, are lesbians," unquote. Such a broad definition, however, has been attacked by those who insist that the ingredient of active sexuality must be present in women's relations before they can appropriately be labeled lesbian. Then, too, there is the other factor, the additionally complicating factor of self-definition. Many pairs of women at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries lived together in this country in devoted pair-bonded relationships for decades. And yet, probably, they would have been repelled at the modern designation lesbian. According to the historian Lila Rupp, these women would have denied, truly or not, that there ever was genital contact between them, and they would further have insisted that neither the frequent physical caresses nor the pronounced emotional intimacy, which they did acknowledge characterized their relationships, would, in their own view of themselves, have warranted the label lesbian. This whole issue of self-definition is central to understanding the gay past and is also a measure of how incomplete our understanding as yet remains. The majority of researchers, though certainly not all, believe that self-identified gay people are strictly a phenomenon of the last 75 to 100 years, and moreover, that that phenomenon itself is strictly confined to the Western world. Before roughly the mid-19th century, these researchers argue, and even in the Western world, no one would have understood our now common notion of homosexual behavior as organized around a self-conscious sexual identity and a behavioral pattern which emphasizes the exclusion of opposite gender attraction. Sexual acts between members of the same gender can be readily documented for any period in human history. But a homosexual identity is, although John Boswell has presented some counter evidence, probably a product of modern times. In other words, the modern homosexual, defined primarily by his or her exclusive sexual orientation and basing a whole way of life on that sexual preference, may well be a unique creation of contemporary Western societies. That creation, in turn, many researchers believe, was to some large extent forced into being by the development of a rigid medical discourse in the late 19th century that insisted on categorizing sexual behavior in order better to regulate sexual behavior. Lillian Fadiman, for example, has argued that doctors' warnings about the pathology of lesbianism at the turn of the 20th century forced a generation of women either to sunder their close relationships with other women or to label themselves lesbians. Yet other scholars, notably George Chauncey Jr., have recently presented data which suggests that Fadiman has attributed inordinate power to the ability of the medical profession to make human behavior conform to its dictates and prescriptions. According to Chauncey, the Fadiman view oversimplifies what is in fact always a complex dialectic in creating sexual identity, which revolves between social conditions, ideology, and consciousness. If we knew more about the structures of homosexuality in everyday life in the past, we might be able to extend Chauncey's analysis. But at this moment, we don't. We are still a long way from unearthing the needed and very elusive evidence about ordinary lives, so-called. About people, in other words, less influenced than were elitist groups by medical discourse. In his study of a turn-of-the-century homosexual scandal in Newport, Rhode Island, Chauncey has at least demonstrated that the working-class sailors and the senior military officials involved in that scandal had no familiarity with current medical literature. That medical literature did not dictate the terms nor organize the understanding of these men in terms of their own sexual behavior. As if the picture were not complicated enough, still other scholars, such as Alan Bray and Randolph Trumbach, have complicated the historical view further by arguing that the origins of a self-conscious homosexual identity and subculture do belong back earlier in human history. Randolph Trumbach places it in the early 18th rather than the late 19th century, and Alan Bray wants to go back at least as far as the Renaissance. Moreover, if we move beyond Western history entirely, and this is difficult to do because at the moment almost all the work has been done on the history of the West, but there are the first emerging studies of homosexuality in Japan and China, and if we look at those works, we see the beginning of an elucidation of cultural systems in which, once again, no homosexuals or heterosexuals like those of the modern West existed in the past, but at the same time, in historic Japan and China, most men did have some homosexual experience, usually across generational and across class lines. The parochial nature of our Western sexual mores has already been eloquently discussed by Esther, and she has also mentioned specifically the Native American figure, the Burdage. I just want to do a bit more on that figure from a historical point of view. The Burdage, usually male, is found historically in many, though not all, North American Indian cultures, and to some extent is found down to the present day. What's most fascinating about this phenomenon historically is that the male Burdage acted and dressed in ways that were comparable but not identical to what was considered appropriate female behavior in Indian tribal life. In other words, the male Burdage serviced males sexually, did women's work, performed social roles reserved for women. Yet the Burdage was not simply an alternate female. In behavior, the Burdage combined elements traditionally assigned to male and female genders, and because of that ability, was endowed with special shamanistic powers and was held in special esteem. Stand back from that, if you will, for just a minute, and give what I think is an appropriate gasp. Because in fact, what the North American Indian tribes were creating in this figure of the Burdage was nothing less than a third gender category. North American Indian tribes were legitimizing, even exalting, individuals who were gender nonconformists. This stands in sharp contrast to our own culture's insistence that nonconformists fit themselves into one or the other of the two pre-existing gender categories, male or female. It is, I think, an eye-opening reversal of our culture's insistence that individuals define themselves either as male or female and adopt their behavior accordingly. Those who refuse being relegated to and defining themselves as the aberrant renegades called transvestites and transsexuals. This sort of scholarship, new scholarship, richly demonstrates, again, as Esther has pointed out, that theories of gender identity and sexual orientation currently dominant in the West are woefully parochial, fatefully undermined in their claims to universality. The new evidence, however, is also discomforting to gay people. In non-Western cultures like China and Japan, the very notion of a homosexual historically had apparently no meaning. And as for the ancient Greeks, the fountainhead of Western culture itself, male-male contact was considered an utterly normal part of the maturation project and culminated not in an adult pattern of exclusive same-gender sexual orientation, but rather in opposite-gender marriages and families. The dominant patterns today of same-gender sexual relations in the West would have mystified the ancient Greeks. An exclusive sexual orientation, lifetime pair bonding between two women or two men of roughly the same age and social station, and the exaltation of emotional and physical mutuality as an ideal would have almost certainly appeared to the Greeks as cause for public complaint and perhaps formal ostracism. This is disturbing to gay people, I think, or to some gay people, only because they tend to look to the past for exact confirmation and therefore justification for their own present behavior. But what if, as seems to be true thus far, Greek homosexuality is not the same as homosexuality in New York in 1987? The tendency on the part of some gay people today to insist on exact historical antecedents is, I think, at base, a defensive posture, a reaction to the long-standing charge that homosexuality is unnatural, and therefore the need to validate our lives by finding exact historical replicas among earlier humans. But I think all this could be turned around very profitably. If it does turn out, in other words, to be true that the homosexual identity, as we currently know it, is something brand new under the sun, well then, why not view that as a claim for a singular achievement for our historical epoch. In the same way that the effort in the mid-late 20th century to achieve a non-hierarchical relationship between men and women, if achieved, could also be hailed as a singular accomplishment in human history, which awaited the present epoch. Clearly, it's I'm afraid I'm going to have to skip a bit if we're going to leave any time for your questions. Let me try to sum up what I've been trying to present to you. As of now, we don't know nearly as much as we would like to know about the history of gay and lesbian people. But if the evidence continues to come forth at a comparable rate, the way it has in the last decade, we do expect a significant increase in our understanding within the next roughly 10 or 20 years. What I want to emphasize in closing is that this is an understanding which promises to enrich us all, straight people as well as gay people, as we moderns have quaintly learned to label ourselves. What we have already discovered in the last 10 years, after all, is no small matter, no minor source of enlightenment. The already available information about how people who came before us organized their sexual behavior and channeled gender nonconformity does throw a powerful highlight on the parochial nature of our own definitions and our own organizing categories. It makes us more aware than we ever have been that issues most of us were taught to view or categories as immutable givens, such as gender identity, sex roles, and sexual orientation, are in fact much closer to being temporary and transient human constructs, functional only for a limited geographical area for a limited period of time. Almost every imaginable configuration of pleasure has been sanctioned by some previous culture. Almost any pattern of sexual behavior has been idealized at some point in the past as, quote, natural. For gay people themselves, recovering the gay past is obviously an essential enterprise. We need to recapture our antecedents in as much detail as possible because we need better to understand what definitions have historically been employed to, quote, explain our existence, what forces were brought to bear to control our behavior, and what strategies our predecessors used to cope with those forces and proceed with their lives. But we do need to recognize not merely that same-gender sexuality has existed through time and across cultures, but also that it has been uncertainly visible, enormously varied, differently invested with symbolic meanings. Knowing this range can reinforce the lesson that nothing connected with human behavior or its categorization remains static. But we do not, as scholars, justify exploring the gay past solely as a tool for enlightening gay people. We believe that the history of homosexual experience has much to say to all human beings about the plasticity, resourcefulness, and diversity of human nature in general. The story of the gay past in the Western world is not merely the story of repression. It is also the story of resistance and survival. It provides unique information about how human beings who are different and who insist on exploring and expressing that differentness pursue their lives in the face of denunciation and oppression. It is my belief that we are all different in our own and not necessarily sexual ways, that we are all more uniquely packaged than most of us care to admit. The courage to be different is at the heart of the true history of gay people, and it can therefore provide courage to anyone striving to discover his or her special nature and to insist that it be respected. Thank you. us from getting up in the audience and haranguing all of us for 10 minutes. In other words, we're allowed to pre-screen at a glance anyway your questions and decide which ones we want to answer. As someone is doubtless going to stand up anyway. You want to pick one?
Well, I'm not sure if these. Oh, I see. This was okay. I guess this is. To me. Have anthropologists and ethnologists identified a society or culture in which homosexual relationships enjoy greater esteem and prestige than conventional heterosexual relationships? I have to say no, but at the same, there's no easy answer to that because prestige in what area, under what circumstances. Is this working? No. Can you hear me?
No, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
No.
No.
Doesn't matter.
They're adjusting it.
They are adjusting it? Yes? No?
Yes.
Does it work now? Okay. Did everyone hear the question? I'll read it again. Okay. Have anthropologists and ethnologists identified a society or culture in which homosexual relationships enjoy greater esteem and prestige than conventional heterosexual relationships? My answer to that has to be no, but on the other hand, there are certainly societies in which, as I tried to point out, in which Marty did too, in which they have absolutely as much esteem as heterosexual relationships. They're just as expected as heterosexual relationships. That's truer of the societies, the age-structured, societies that have age-structured homosexuality. And there it's really part of a life pattern that, in the New Guinea case, all males have to have both heterosexual and homosexual experience, and it is expected. And actually, the work is kind of interesting because one of the anthropologists who studied this, he tried to find out how the little boys reacted to this. And of course, the conventional response would be, oh, they would think it was so disgusting and they wouldn't want to do it. Well, what he discovered was a range of reactions from the little boys. I mean, some of them were kind of reluctant and thought, oh, yuck, and apparently said this. And others were very enthusiastic, and there was a whole range, just as there is for dating, say, in our society. The situation's a little different with the gender-bending kind of relationships, where these are set apart. These people are set apart, the gender benders, and in some ways they have greater prestige, and relationships with them have great prestige in some societies because they're in touch with the supernatural. So I guess that's my answer. I guess I can't elaborate on it more. There's so much more for us to know that anything at this point is really provisional. There might turn out to be societies in which that will be true.
Here's one you might just want to announce.
Announce?
Let me look at a couple more.
Sure.
I don't like these.
I participated in the civil disobedience on 10/13 at the Supreme Court. And the exact number of people arrested was 907. DC police gave us this figure as the last of us was arraigned. Would it be possible to correct this figure tonight? And I just, Marty and I between us did just correct it. I was very tuned into the civil disobedience because although I didn't do it myself, my life partner who's in the audience was the very first one to get arrested, which I'm quite proud of.
This is a question on identity, addressed to both of us. Esther and Marty, identity means many different things to different people and may change over time. What constitutes sexual identity? Is it participation in an act, I think, or community, or can it take on more subtler forms of expression? Well, I'll try first. It's clearly one of the big issues, not only in history. To give you a concrete example, if we're talking about a lesbian woman engaged in S&M, does that make her closer in identity to a lesbian woman not interested in S&M, or to a straight woman who is interested in S&M? What I'm trying to suggest is that the debate centers on whether our identity as gay and lesbian people hinges on our sexual acts, or whether it hinges on a culture that may in part relate to those acts, but is not solely based on them. I think that is in fact going to be the main subject that we're going to talk about on the second evening, this next Saturday night. My own feeling is that to try to talk about gay identity, what the elements are that make it up, is no more or less difficult than trying to talk about, is there a Jewish novel? In other words, almost all of us reading Philip Roth would clearly recognize that there is something in the texture of his work that bespeaks a Jewish consciousness, a Jewish identity. But if we were forced to try to delimit and describe the elements that make up that Jewish identity, we would be very hard-pressed to do it. And yet the category exists. I think the same thing is true of gay people. I think gay people have clearly had in the West, in the last 100 years at least, a different historic experience than straight people. You may want in your heads to use the analogy of black people. Is there a black subculture in this country? Clearly blacks had a different historical experience. To that degree, I would argue, whether we're talking about blacks or gay people, to that degree, we are different. I think what separates the liberals from the radicals in the gay movement has always been this question of identity. The liberals in every movement, not just the gay movement, in the black movement, what the liberals said was, look, we're just folks, except we have a different color skin. The liberals in the gay movement say, look, we're just folks, except we have a different sexual orientation. The radicals would say, we're not just folks. We have a different historical experience. We see the world with different eyes, not wholly different eyes, of course, but with somewhat different eyes, and that's what defines a gay subculture and a gay identity. I could go on, but won't.
Well, I could say something more succinct, maybe, which is I think that any identity, whether it's sexual or religious, ethnic, military, whatever, any identity is made up of a subjective sense of what you are, and it's made up of other people's judgments. It's made up of confirmations and disconfirmations, we call them. So to take an example that comes to mind, a lot of people in Europe, especially France and Germany, didn't identify as Jewish and didn't feel subjectively that they were particularly Jewish or at all Jewish. Well, when the Nazis came along, the Nazis said, you're Jewish. That's it. You're Jewish, and whether you like it or not. So that was a confirmation of their identity, whether they had a subjective sense of it or not. Of course, that's been a very powerful stimulant to Jewish identity worldwide, that particular experience. And I think it's no different for any kind of identity. To take a gay example, there have been, in recent years, a number of women who said, well, I'm a lesbian. Well, I haven't slept with a woman, but, you know, I'm a feminist. I believe in ending the oppression of women. Well, I remember the consternation with which I greeted these kinds of announcements. I couldn't believe it. I thought, what do you mean you're a lesbian? You know, you're a lesbian because you believe in feminism? I don't get it. And So my response, for one, was very disconfirming of their assertion that they were lesbians. And I don't think I won many friends for that, but now I, of course, mellowed a lot, and it's like, if you think you're a lesbian, okay, you are one. So I'm more supportive now.
Here's another one for both of us. Why don't you take a crack? Again, this is to both of us. Do you both believe that it is actually possible to be genuinely, by choice, bisexual? Do you not believe that true homosexuality is only that? And most of all, how do you think homosexuality occurs and when in each human life? Boy, they're not sending up any easy ones, are they? You want?
Yeah, I do. Again, I was one of those skeptics at first about bisexuality, and those of you who are gay will know this. Those of you who are not gay will not know this. But the party line within gay life is that there really aren't any bisexuals. They just really are homosexuals, and they're afraid to say it, and so on. And I accepted that for a long time, and now I've come to believe that there really are, and I'm accepting other people's, what they say about themselves. There was a woman in Washington who got up at the workshop, town hall sexuality workshop, and made a very moving statement about being a bisexual and her ambivalent relationship to the gay community because of the disconfirmations of her identity from both the gay community and the straight world. So on that bisexual question, I do think there is bisexuality. The second part was what makes people homosexual?
I guess. How do you think homosexuality occurs and when in each human life?
Well, from my experience, if it does occur, it occurs at different times in people's lives. And in particular, it seems to occur differently for men and women. Men typically experiencing fantasies and so on earlier. But actually, the how is the part that's really the kicker. That is really the kicker. And it goes back to, this group, the Mehanaku that I was talking about, they say, when the anthropologists asked them, is there any homosexuality, they just laughed. It was like, what? What's that? Are they just lying? I guess that goes back to the bisexual question. They don't have any more taboos than we do. In fact, they have less. I am a social constructionist, but in this society, I do not know the answer, nor does anyone know the answer, of what causes either heterosexual or homosexual desire. And of course, homosexual desire looks more problematic since everyone's telling you should have heterosexual desire, but it's real. To my mind, I don't think anyone has answered that.
Yeah. Remember that these questions could only arise in our society in the last 100 years. All the data I presented to you about the ancient world suggests the meaninglessness of these questions in any broader context. Is anybody naturally a bisexual? Well, empirically in Athens, everybody was a bisexual, so what would that question have meant? One other general point is that this kind of question, if it needs to be asked at all, I think has to be asked in tandem with what causes heterosexuality. We know that the question, what causes homosexuality, has traditionally been raised by homophobes who are interested in causes only so that they can pronounce cures. The question itself has become a political issue. If it's going to be raised and an attempt to answer it made, we have to talk about how sexual identity is formed in a modern Western society, not how does homosexual desire alone manifest itself. For example, you could turn all this around, and I think we should turn it around, and you could ask, why is it that in modern America, heterosexual men have been trained with such seeming success not to find people of the same gender sexually desirable. Since throughout most of human history, people of the same gender seem to have found each other sexually attractive with no trouble at all. What is it about our aberrant, peculiar socialization process which has produced this curious breed, unknown previously to human history, of exclusive heterosexual men unable to turn on to their own sex?
No, let's go with this. Okay, regarding the Gay Studies Center at CUNY, this is a question I like to answer. When exactly does it start, first? 2, what topics will be covered? And 3, can students declare a major in gay studies? When exactly does it start? I can't exactly answer that. What's happened is that the provost, is that his title? Pershansky?
President.
The president of the Graduate Center has, in principle, said he thinks it's a good idea. We have the use of their nonprofit number. He has said that we have to raise money to get it going, but in principle, he accepts it. That is a tremendous step forward for us. So it's starting this year, and as Marty said, it's starting in the sense that we're going to have an event, that we're starting to fundraise, that we're having an event in November, at which I will speak about my research in Cherry Grove. George Chauncey will speak about his research in gay male history in New York, and Jewel Gomez will talk about gays in the Harlem Renaissance. Is that what she's? Something like that.
Minority communities.
Yeah. And that's November 17th. Yeah. Okay, we hope that each year will get bigger and bigger. That's the first thing. What topics will be covered? Well, we hope there'll be public events that will cover various topics, and there will also be various seminars that will address different topics. We have some ideas about that, but it seems a little... We'll study, well, certainly the history of gays and lesbians, certainly these cross-cultural questions about art and aesthetics, and we hope a broad range. And 3, can students declare a major in gay studies? No, because we think that probably teaching courses will be one of the latest things. Before that, we hope to establish more of a think tank for students and faculty. Teaching is a more politically difficult issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd just add a few words to that. Since this is a first of its kind, we're going to have to start very slowly. And we think that our first project would most profitably be just a scholarly directory of who's working in the area of gay and lesbian studies. And then we'll convene a couple of, as Esther said, sort of scholarly think tank colloquia. After that, and ultimately, we do hope to do everything that an institute would do. We hope to teach courses, we hope to have majors, we hope to provide research funding for, say, doctoral candidates who would like to do research in the field but can't find traditional funding to do so. And we hope that it will spread. What we need right now, we might as well close with a financial pitch, we need some support. We think maybe the best way to raise, all we need for the first year is $50,000. I say only because as institutes go, that's pennies, and all it's going to give us is a part-time assistant sitting on half a desk. But that will be enough to get us going, and we think maybe the best way is to get 400 people who might be willing to pledge $10 a month for the first year. Pershansky tells us that if we can get the first year's budget, after that, he will turn us over to the CUNY's professional fundraisers and PR people, and that hopefully it'll be easier. I should say that in our first efforts, we're all academics, swamped, we meaning the members of the organizing board, we're swamped by 1,000 other responsibilities and commitments, and yet we're having to do, mailings and fundraising and all the rest of it. Still, in our amateur way, the very first foundation we went to, the Crow Foundation, has already given us $2,500 for seed money. So it looks promising, but if any of you have any ideas about fundraising or funding sources, we would be eager to hear them. The only other suggestion given to us by a professional fundraiser was that we find people to give house parties in the first few months. That is, people willing to gather 20 of their own friends and have one member from our organizing board come and talk to that house party in the hopes that we can get a couple of supporting $10 a month people from that. We'd like to hear any of your suggestions on it. There's going to be an open meeting on the center. Is it the 21st?
Next week, isn't it?
Yeah.
21st.
21st? Not this Sunday, yeah.
Yeah.
The 21st at the Gay Community Center on 13th Street at 8 o'clock. So you're all very welcome to come to that if you'd like, if you have CUNY affiliations. It's supposed to be CUNY for now, just so we get input from the CUNY community itself. I'm told that our time is up, so that's it for tonight, and thanks for your response and your questions, and I hope many of you will come back for the rest of the series. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.